All right, I just saw a couple flurry of people just join, so that's good. I'm glad we waited a little bit for them to arrive. However, we do want to make sure that we keep this at about a 30-minute pace, as we mentioned in the um, blurb that we sent out to everybody about the webinar itself. So again, I'm glad to see that there's quite a few people attending today, and let's just get right to it. Now you'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen you do have the GoToWebinar software, and if you look down towards the bottom there's a questions section. This is your communication area. If I'm talking about something, you need some clarification, or if you just have any question in general, well, not in general, but having to do with wide dynamic range, go ahead and fire it into that question section. On my side, actually not next to me, but he is on my organizer side, is my boss and the FLIR training manager, Chris Winbun. Been around for a long time, got a lot of great knowledge in his head that I pick from all the time. So feel free to play Stump the Webinar Guy and see if you can come up with a question maybe we can't answer, because if I can't, I bet Chris can. So anyway, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me and can see my screen. So let's use that question section over on the right-hand side, and go ahead, somebody type something in there saying, yes, I hear you and I see your screen. You don't have to really type anything in there really that you don't want to, but just put something in there so I know that I am being heard. All right, there we go. They're flooding in. All right, good job. Thank you, folks. Well, let's just get started then. And like I said, we're going to try to keep this right to a half hour, but sometimes questions go a little bit over, or if we get too many questions, sometimes we just can't get to all of them. And that would still be fine, because what we can do then is I'll go back after the webinar is done and I'll look at all those questions and anything that's still up there. I've got everybody's email address for when you registered for the webinar, so we can always send those answers after the fact. So let's just get started here, and you can see up on the screen we are here to talk about wide dynamic range. It's one of those things I think that most people see in specs a lot, and maybe they just don't understand exactly what WDR is, or wide dynamic range. So we're going to get into that today, and as we go forward, again, it's not too long of a slide deck, and then at the end we'll sort of show some of the FLIR products that do contain WDR and the different types, which we'll talk about as we go forward. So to talk about wide dynamic range, though, the first thing we really need to understand is what dynamic range is, right? I mean, wide is a qualifier basically, but dynamic range is really what we're talking about. And then, of course, the style of cameras that have wide dynamic range, why you need it, when you would use it, and maybe when it's not a good fit for certain applications. So if we look forward on the next slide right here, you can see, what is dynamic range? As I mentioned, this is the first thing we need to understand. And dynamic range is really simply, it's basically the ratio of the darkest point in your image to the lightest point. As you can see here in this example, yeah, go ahead, Chris. What's up? Chris?
I don't believe your slide advanced.
Really?
Marty.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
Not advance.
That's interesting. I'm looking at it. You don't see anything on the screen? Hold on, let's see if we have a pausing or something. Stop, show.
I see your screen.
Let me know when you see that. I'm trying to adjust something here to see.
Oh,
I might have had that paused for some reason. I don't know how that happened. Okay. All right, well, let's take a look again. As I was describing, we have an image here of inside an office area. And you can see in the windows, we have, now these are arbitrary numbers I just assigned to this just so we could show the ratio, basically, of the highest or the brightest point in an image, which is rendered up here in the windows, right? The streaming light coming in from the outside. And then, of course, we have a very darker area in the same exact scene represented by the back of these chairs right here. So basically, again, the dynamic range is the ratio between the darkest area of an image to the brightest area of that same image. So now that we understand what dynamic range is, let's go a little bit further. Here's a bit of a chart, right? Don't get overwhelmed by the sort of technology itself, because all we're looking at basically here is to understand this being the dynamic range. Now, as you can see right here in the scene, as illumination rises, when there's not enough illumination, of course, things are too dark to see. There's just no way to render any detail in an area where there's just not any light. We can't create light out of nothing, right? And as the illumination rises, it'll eventually get to a certain point where there's too much illumination, and that's referred to as saturation, right? If things get whited out, basically, is probably the most common term that people use in a scene. So the camera's ability to see between the lowest area right here, and it has to be above the noise floor, right? It has to be enough light where we can see something, and that sort of begins right here, right above the noise floor. And then as the illumination rises again, there comes that certain point where it can no longer really render any details of the image simply because there is too much light in the image. So the dynamic range is basically the ability, or from the lowest to the highest area of a particular scene. And that's all really this chart is talking about. So let's go on to the next slide just to sort of understand the dynamic range itself. You'll see here this is a representation of a grayscale. It's not scientific or anything, right? A camera with no WDR may be shifted farther over to the right or farther to the left on here. This red box is just supposed to represent the range, right? So the dynamic range is here we have the lowest or the darkest part of the grayscale, and then here we have the highest that can actually render. So the dynamic range of a camera with no WDR is relatively limited, right? You can't be too dark and you can't be too light, otherwise you're just not going to see any of those details. Now, conversely, if we now change to a wide dynamic range, you can see it's wider, right? The areas on that grayscale, we can now see brighter light, and we can also see in darker darks than we could with a camera that did not have the WDR technology built into it. So in a nutshell, really that's what wide dynamic range is the ability for the camera to give us more details that can be seen by the eye on both the high end, the really bright areas of a scene, and also on the low end or the very dark areas of a scene. So when do we really need that wide dynamic range? Well, if you remember back on that on the second slide, basically, where we showed the 1 to 400 illumination ratio, this is the time when you're going to need the wide dynamic range, when you have an area where you're inside, maybe looking outside. And you can see these two pictures right here. They both represent a camera with no WDR engaged. And at a certain point, without the ability to have a wide range of things to be able to see, it has to make a choice. So it either has to, as you can see under the Y section over here, the camera has to make a choice between a short exposure and a long exposure, and it can't do both of those at the same time. So if you look over here on the left-hand side, this is what we consider a short exposure, and we can tell this simply because it's the shutter itself is not open long enough to render enough light in this area where it's very dark. And this, conversely, on the next picture right here is the longer exposure, which means the shutter itself stays open longer on the camera, and we'll talk about that technology as we go into the next slide. But you can see it's one or the other, right? It either has to keep that shutter open to let more light in, and you can see the problem here, right? This is the grading of the image. I can't see anything when there's too much light let into the camera. And as you can see back on the left-hand side, I can see certain areas of brightness. But if the shutter is not open long enough to let enough light into the camera, I will not able to see in some of these darker areas right here. So exposure is really what we're talking about. Now, I should have warned those that possibly have a risk of some problems with flashing lights and stuff to make sure nobody has any seizure. I hope everybody was sitting down before they came to this slide. But on the left-hand side, you can see exposure itself, whether it's long or short exposure, which we were just talking about. The exposure is a combination of two things, both the shutter speed and the aperture, or f-stop, as you can see on the right. So if you look on the left-hand side, those two flashing boxes, the one on the far left is a fast shutter, which means it opens and closes very quickly. And because it opens and closes very quickly, less light is able to pass through the shutter. And right next to it, we see the slow shutter speed, where if it's open longer, clearly more light is going to be able to pass through just based on time, right? It's open longer based on these two things, maybe 3 or 4 times longer. So based on these two flashing things, the one on the right is probably going to let in about 4 times as much light as the one on the left because it's too fast, opening and closing on the left, to let enough light pass through. Now, combined with the shutter speed itself, how long the shutter is actually open, is the size of the opening, right, or the aperture. Think of it as the iris in your eye, right, or the pupil, excuse me, in your eye. When it's very bright out, your pupil tends to contract, or constrict itself, so it doesn't get drowned out by too much light, right, reaching that saturation level that we were talking about. And then if you go all the way back up to the other one here, the f1.4, this is a wide open iris, right? This is trying to let as much light in as possible so it can render images and details in a particular scene. And if you look at the opening and closing there, this is just an auto iris camera. This is a sort of graphical representation of what it does. And the camera itself will, with auto iris, will control the amount of light that's coming in based on the size, and it works in conjunction with the shutter speed, how long the shutter is open to provide that light. So that's basically exposure, and this is why we need to sort of talk about how exposure comes into play when we're referring to WDR, or wide dynamic range. So how does a WDR camera work? Well, we talked about exposure already, right? The short exposure, which is the picture you see on the left-hand side, means we have a very fast shutter. It's open very short period of time, right? It's fast. Open, close, open, close. That is what's considered a short exposure, and that allows us to be able to see in the windows. And that's not the greatest picture. I blew it up so I can show it on the slide here, and it was a low-resolution picture. But you can see what we're talking about here in these two images is light. So on the left-hand side picture in the fast shutter, it's opening and closing very quickly. And because of that, we see fine from the outside, but because it's not open long enough to render enough light to the image, we don't see what's in the foreground, this blob of blackness that's right here. And if we look over on the right-hand side, now the other type of hurdle, of course, is an exposure that's too long. The shutter is open for too long of a period of time, and too much light passes in from the outside windows. And you can see what it does to the image. I can see now the foreground, which was not exposed enough before, but because the shutter was open for so long, or open too wide, or both, too much light is coming into this image and is completely degrading everything, right? It's completely washed out about half of the entire image. So really, this is what a WDR camera has to overcome through a number of different ways that we'll talk about as we go forward. Now, wide dynamic range, this is what I was referring to. There are a number of ways that it's actually done. We have digital WDR, which is really reliant on the digital signal processor to sort of make a guess, right? It has to look at an image, and it has to brighten up the darker areas electronically, right, using the digital signal processor, and then it has to try to dim some of the bright lights that are out there somehow. So digital WDR is primarily done on the digital signal processor and does not have a lot to do with the shutter itself and how many times it's actually taking a picture. Now, however, if you look over on the right-hand side, multi-shutter WDR, clearly, just based on these pictures, it looks better. Multi-shutter WDR was sort of the first, what we called true WDR. It's not that the other type, the digital WDR, is fake, but true WDR actually uses more than one image to combine together. Remember that long and short exposures that we just saw in the previous slide? What the multi-shutter WDR is able to do is actually take more than one picture at the same time, one at the fast shutter, one at the low shutter, and then they combine them together to make the multi-shutter WDR. So let's take a look at this right here. As I was just describing, the short exposure is on the left-hand side. The shutter is opening and closing very quickly, so you have a short exposure. And again, just like we saw on that first slide, I can see light very well from the outside. But I cannot see enough detail here in the darker areas simply because not enough light was exposed to the camera's lens and image sensor to be able to produce any good details in there. This is below that threshold that we were looking at on that second slide with that graph that was on there. This is the noise line, basically. Anything below that, we simply can't see it. The camera is not able to render enough details. But if we combine that short exposure with a long exposure, again, taking basically two pictures almost simultaneously, now what we do is we combine those to get the multi-shutter WDR over here. We take the short exposure, which is good here and not so good here, and we combine it with the long exposure, which is not so good here, and it is much better here. I can see more details. And we combine them together so we can see good here and good here. We can actually see color a little bit better represented, and we don't have the washout from the long exposure, which was too much light coming in on this one and too little coming in on this one. So by combining them together, this is done more on the image sensor, although the digital signal processor still is part of it, right? It always processes the image that's coming in from the sensor. But it is heavily dependent more so on the image sensor itself versus the digital signal processor. The DSP just combines the best parts, gives us one image that looks a lot better. Now, the other type is the digital WDR. And as I mentioned already, it's heavily reliant on that DSP in order to, now if you see the second line in this paragraph up on the top, it's actually a non-linear amplification, right? What does that mean? It just basically means that it's not a specific thing. It goes up and it goes down, all based on the amount of light that it has, its ability to control the shutter, making it open and close faster or slower, and also that same thing with the iris, making it either bigger or larger. However, it only takes one scan of the image. So it's always, at least at this point, going to be not quite as good visually as the multi-shutter. However, if you look on the right-hand side, as newer digital signal processors come to market, they're getting faster, more powerful, they have more capabilities, and now if you look at my sort of graphic on the bottom, right, the yellow dart represents the multi-shutter WDR, or true WDR as it's referred to sometimes, and the red darts indicate, the excuse me, the digital WDR. So you can see back in the day when we first came out with the technology, the digital WDR was nowhere near as good looking as that multi-shutter WDR. However, as the new chipsets are coming out, and this never stops, right? It keeps going and going. So not only will digital WDR improve, which is what I'm sort of showing here. Also, the multi-shutter is going to improve as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward, because I showed you a graph that showed it combining two images. But as we speak, basically, I think we're up to, some cameras at least, can actually take and render up to 4 different images all at the same time, all at different exposures, and then combine those together. So both of them are increasing, as you know, all the time, but you can see based on this dartboard on the right hand side, the new DSPs make it much, much closer. So there's nothing wrong with digital WDR. However, visually, still at this point, you're probably going to see a better visual solution with the multi-shutter WDR. But again, that digital WDR is catching it, and they're getting much, much closer together. So as far as the combination goes, I love this slide, right? I actually was doing a lot of research for the webinar itself, and I was trying to find how do you measure WDR. And I found a couple of very, we'll just not malign them too much, right? But they're very technical documents, and you can see all of these equations that I harvested out from somebody who was actually an engineer and actually creating the technology itself. Now, this is completely overwhelming to me. I don't understand it, right? I know this means digital, excuse me, dynamic range, right, equals whatever this means. And down here, SNR is signal to noise ratio, which also is an important factor in WDR cameras. But again, this means really nothing to me. And most of the people on this webinar, in the industry at least, are going to be people selling cameras and systems, distributing them, and even some end users who just want to understand what that WDR spec means on the spec sheets that they see when they're trying to compare 2 different cameras. So what I've done, I did a further research then, and I found out basically that there's a sort of non-scientific way, right? This is the scientific way for the eggheads, the people that can really understand all this, but we need to understand it on a sort of our level, so we can then translate that to our customers so they understand exactly what WDR is and why we need it and when we need it. Right? Because we don't always, right? It's not magic. It's not an elixir that you can apply to something and make it better at all times. There are specific case uses for WDR. So anyway, we do need to find out how WDR is measured, and you can see right here, just based on this screen, we use decibels, or dB for short. I'm sure anybody that's seen a camera cut sheet has noticed that that is exactly how they sort of show the camera itself. Like this camera has 98 dB, this one has 122. It all depends on the measurement itself. And you can see there the decibel itself, it's a logarithmic unit, and it's used to express the ratio basically of 2 values. One of those values is generally fixed, which allows us then to, using that logarithmic unit measurement, to be able to judge and assign a certain decibel level to a particular camera's output. And if you look down at the bottom again, as we talked about true or multi-shutter WDR, generally we're referring to cameras that are above 100 decibels or higher. Now that's even shifting as well, right? There's cameras that are coming out that are a little bit lower than 100, and they're still being able to produce the wide dynamic range image. Now, as we go forward, This was the sort of, now I even put it in here with the little asterisk and the not scientific, right? This is something that's generally accepted by the photography people out there, the people that really understand how to actually use dynamic range when they're creating their pictures, for instance. They have a lot of post-production stuff that allows them to go back into the picture using Photoshop or whatever they use to make the picture better. In surveillance, we just don't have that option, right? It takes the video and it's moved on. We need to be able to render it immediately. So we have a lot less to do with it. So what we do is we assign them a certain value, again, based on that logarithmic value that we talked about, or the comparison, the ratio between the two of them. So a 50 decibel camera is not really considered WDR at all. As a matter of fact, that's sort of the low threshold. As you start to get above that, you start seeing cameras that will describe themselves as WDR cameras. Now, wide is a relative term, right? So older chips and older image sensors that possibly had a lot lower dB than the current ones, can you say this is wide dynamic range? Well, if you compare it to the older ones, maybe it is. But that's the sort of trade-off that you have to understand. Two different camera manufacturers could have exactly the same decibel notation on their cameras, and if you put them side by side, they could perform wildly different. So we have to use these sort of with a grain of salt, right? We have to, now again, if I'm comparing a 50 to a 120, I should see a wide difference, and I should expect that but anything that's relatively close, like 50 and 42 or 75 and 79, you probably aren't going to see a whole lot of difference in the two of those. But let's go forward then and take a look. Now, as I pointed out, that this is the equation, sort of the non-scientific equation, that when you get above 50 decibels, the curve that's in one of the charts that I'm not really displaying in the webinar here, but the curve starts to flatten itself out a little bit, and then basically every 6 decibels higher, so say I start at like 62, if I go up to 68, that gives me one further f-stop, which you can see the range here is what we talked about before. As I increase decibels, my range, both low and high, that I can render and then I can actually see details for, increases. And then as we go a little bit higher and higher, as you can see here, we have the 98. And again, this is about what we still consider, or we start to consider, that true WDR. Ideally, basically, if the camera cannot produce something around 100, it's almost always going to be digital WDR, right? Anything above 100, you can't say for sure, but you can start to assume that that's probably the true WDR or the multi-shutter WDR, okay? All right, so again, you can go to 110. Now, even this is not a great representation because probably this red box should be slid a little further to the right. We can handle light. There are ways to do this. It's tough to handle darkness, right? If you have no light at all, no matter what sort of magic lens and DSP you have and signal, the signal processor and the image sensor, without light, you simply can't render anything unless, of course, it's one of the other FLIR type cameras, the thermal cameras that don't use visible light. So when it comes to visible light, most likely the wide dynamic range that we're looking at here would be shifted up a little bit higher on this grayscale. All right, I think this is a great time to sort of reach back to the crowd. And Chris, do we have any questions so far on what we've covered? And now again, this is a very quick webinar, so we're not going into the technical details too much. We just need to explain sort of what it is, how it's applied, and the places where we basically need the WDR. So Chris, any questions? Oh, I think we may have...
Marty, the question queue is currently clear.
Excellent. All right, well, as you can see, we're based... Yep, I can hear you, Chris. Based on our time frame here, it looks like we're coming up towards the end of it again. We just wanted to give a bit of an understanding of this. Now, if in the future you have other questions, or even tonight after we get off the webinar, if you have any questions about WDR that you couldn't think of while we were sitting here, please feel free, send me an email. And there's going to be a lot of people who may be registered for the webinar and were not able to attend. If they're listening to this now after the fact, you have the same option. You can send me an email. My name is Marty Major, and our email structure at FLIR is very easy to understand. It's first name dot last name at FLIR.com. So I'm marty.major@FLIR.com, and I'd love to answer questions. Let's go forward, and I think we're about done with the actual webinar, but let's go ahead and summarize what we've covered here in these past 25 minutes or so. At the top, we can see the cameras without the WDR technology. when there's a wide range between the brightest areas, the higher lux rating, and the lower areas, the darker areas with the lower lux rating, the camera's it struggles, right? It cannot render both. So it has to sort of choose between the long exposure and the short exposure. And we saw based on some of the pictures that we looked at, that can be a little troubling, right? The white light can wash out a good deal of the picture. And conversely, if I don't have enough light, say with lights coming through the window or something, all the things on the inside, of course, are simply going to be too dark when you only have one image. So with without WDR, it basically has to choose whether it wants to use a short exposure or a long exposure, and you're stuck with that. Now, again, so are cameras without WDR technology good cameras? Of course they are. There are certain situations where we need WDR, and again, those are going to be places where you have a lot of light that's coming in too bright in one part of the scene. For instance, like we saw sitting inside looking outside, maybe in a loading dock or somewhere. If you're inside and you're trying to look out, the light is too bright. You can't really see based on the camera's technology. You have no ability to see that. You can see what's inside and not outside, or the opposite, right? If you use the opposite exposure, you can see what's outside, but then again, not inside. So whenever you have a scene with a wide variation, now this is an important thing as well. We saw in that very first slide, the 400 lux versus 1 lux, and I told you that was an arbitrary number that I came up with. However, there are lux meters. That's what they're for. So to determine if you're going on a walkthrough or whatever it is, and you're trying to determine, do I need a WDR camera in this situation? Use that lux meter, right? Point it to the areas of the most brightness and figure out how bright that is, and then point it to the areas of the least brightness, or the more dark areas of the image, and figure out what that lux is. And if the lux are wide apart, right? Again, the wider the ratio, the more WDR technology is going to help out in that scene. It's going to be able to render both of them, the bright and the darker areas. But again, there's still limits, right? It can't magically see everything, and we cannot create light in certain areas. So we have to use the different exposures to be able to do that, either keeping the shutter open longer to let more light pass through, and that will help in the darker areas, or the opposite of that, opening the shutter very quickly to not let a lot of light pass through, so we can actually don't get flooded by the light itself. So WDR, by combining them, and again, we're in the middle one now here, so cameras with the digital WDR technology in scenes, again, where there's a wide variation. The digital WDR will digitally enhance these areas. It uses a lot of processing power from the digital signal processor. Sometimes I've read that could possibly lower your frame rate, right? Because frame rate has a lot to do with the digital signal processor as well. And if it's working really, really hard in super bright versus super dark areas, some of that power is, being sucked out, and it can't give you the highest frame rates possibly. This is not always the case, but it's something to pay attention to and make sure that you're not limiting your frame rate just because your digital signal processor can't handle the scene, the light that's in the scene, or the light variance in that scene. And then finally at the bottom we've got the cameras with the multi-shutter. This is the preferred method, but again, the digital WDR is rapidly approaching our abilities to see the same type of things that we do in the multi-shutter WDR. However, the multi-shutter, I think it's easy to understand, right? It's actually taking two different exposures almost at the same exact time. Now, to our eyes, it's the same time, but there is one sort of thing to worry about a little bit with multi-shutter WDR as well, because it is taking two different exposures, again, very fast. But if there's fast motion in your scene, you may see a little bit of ghosting, right? It's called motion blur, basically. Now, can the camera compensate for that? Of course. We have a thing called motion compensation that the digital signal processor will try to apply to that if there is fast motion in your scene. And again, the only reason it happens is because as something moves, even if I take two very fast shutters, right one after the other, like within milliseconds of each other, if the object or the person is going too fast, it's basically taking a picture of the object at two different locations, even though it's very close to it. And that's what sort of causes this this motion blur based on if you're using the multi-shutter WDR. Now, not weirdly, I guess, but because of that multi-shutter, it's a physical thing, right? It simply, it can try to adjust for that. But in reality, the digital WDR actually performs a little bit better in high motion scenes because it's not taking two different images, it's just taking one, and then the digital signal processor has to be able to do its magic to sort of render, and use that logarithm basically to give us the best image that it can. It's going to enhance the darker areas and it's going to lessen some of the light out of the areas that are too bright. So that's basically the summary of what we've talked about here. Now I do want to show towards the end here, and I guess we'll just check here. Oh, I think we do have a question, Chris. I think one has come in. And it says, when would you not use WDR? Useful for outdoor? Well, WDR almost always is going to be used in an outdoor situation simply because in indoor, we don't have the lighting problems that we do outdoors, right? Indoors, we have a much more even lighting. There's still going to be some reasons to use it indoors, right? Especially if you're facing outdoors where that light is coming in. But an indoor setting without too many windows or bright lights or everything's more even, you really don't need a WDR camera. Now, I know, in the industry, it's the buzzword, right? Everybody thinks they need WDR. And again, there's many situations. If you don't have a scene, if you don't have, an environment that has two drastically different levels of light in that same scene, there's no reason for WDR. For instance, that ratio that we talked about, the 1:400 that I saw in the first slide, if that ratio is down to like 1:2, 1:4, much more even lighting, really no need for WDR. I mean, the WDR is the whole reason for its purpose is to try to overcome those visual hurdles that we talked about. Too dark in one area, too bright in another area. I have to make a choice, if I don't have WDR and the camera's going to show me, it's going to show me one of them halfway good, or maybe not even both. If you really have a really dark area and a really bright area, cameras without WDR technology could suffer in both of those areas. So you don't always get one out of the two, although if it's somewhat evener, a lot of times the camera without WDR will render one of those nicely, but the other one's going to suffer, like those two kids we saw sitting in front of the big window there. So with that said, I do want everybody to take a look at well, first I'll thank you for attending with an exclamation point after it. And the last thing we do want to do is let's go ahead and take a look at the aerial camera that I already have open. Now you can see let's go to the live so we can take a look at what this looks like. It's my living room looking out the windows here. I wish it was sunnier today, but it's overcast, so I couldn't get the great, like I did it yesterday and it looked a lot better because there was a ton more light coming in. The sun was much more intense than the actual cloud cover is. But you can still see in this image, I have WD off right now. And so what it's done is it's made a trade-off. It says, okay, I need to render this so it can be seen well. And even towards the very top, it's still getting a little bit washed out, but I can still see pretty good based on that flood of light that's coming in through the windows. However, if you look into the shadows here in the fireplace, you can't really make out any details because, like I said, it's made a choice. It has to determine what is the best or what can I render, and so it's going to show this massive amount of light. Now let's take a look at the settings in this aerial camera. If I come right here, now you can see it. I don't have to come back to the live, but you can see right here the digital WDR, which it tells you right in the camera interface, is if I go ahead and just crank it to high so you can see the difference here. Now again, I can't see anything in the shadows because it's made that trade-off, right? It's showing me, so it's rendering this, which is looking good and crisp and clear. Now if I go to the high WDR, you can clearly see the difference. Let's go back to live so you can see a little bit bigger. Now I can actually see these. This is it's a glass front, so I'm seeing the reflection from these. But basically you can tell that now all the things that used to be in the shadow, now I can make out what everything is in this image versus back when I had it before with it off. Go back to live, where you can see there's not a lot being rendered here. There's not enough light in here. It's actually made the trade-off. It's showing me the short exposure, so not too much light floods in, but it needs a sort of long exposure or the digital signal processor in its case, because we're doing this electronically, to be able to do that. Now if I step it up, which is the last thing that I'll do, if you go to low, just keep an eye on the picture on the right. I'll let it take its time. And if I go to medium, you can see it gets a little bit better. And then finally, if I get all the way to high, it looks the best and the cleanest. So with that said, I'm going to let you guys go back to your day then. And again, thank you for attending. We do have lots of other webinars coming up. And what I want to sort of reach out to the audience, I want to find out from you folks what you want to learn about, right? What technologies may be a little bit fuzzy. We'll do a webinar on it. We'll do a training video on that. We don't want to be producing stuff that has no value to people. So we want you guys to let us know what it is that we could possibly cover in the future that would be a benefit to you. All right, with that said, thanks for attending then, and keep an eye on your email because within a day or two, you should get a link to the recorded webinar in case you need to show it to your compadres that work with you, or if you just had such a great time listening to me this time, you want to hear it again, you'll be able to do that as well. So again, we're done. I will let you guys go now, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks.